Hello, you are listening to Talk the Line. I'm Jen Long. This is our weekly podcast uploaded every Friday where I talk to a musician about something that they are deeply passionate about, that kind of specialist subject that they might sit in that big chair and talk about on Mastermind. You can check out all our previous episodes at talktheline.blog. Talk the Line alumni include Anne-Marie, Nadine Shah, Dan from Bastille, Oh Wonder, Kate Nash, Marika Hackman, Johnny Flynn, Naughty Boy, and Amanda Palmer. You can follow us on Twitter at Talk the Line. You can follow me at Jen Long on social media. And it is easy to subscribe to this podcast. It means it gets downloaded every Friday automatically onto your listening device and makes us look massive in the charts. Got in the top 30 once. Big deal. Today's guest, Max Richter, was one of the first composers to combine classical and electronic elements with a post-rock sensibility, something which was radical when he began his career at the start of the 21st century. The German-born British composer is one of the most influential voices in post-minimalist composition and has also made a name for himself as a prolific writer of music for film, television and stage. His work has been featured in films from the likes of Martin Scorsese, and he's scored an episode of Black Mirror, as well as HBO show The Leftovers. This month sees expanded new editions of Max's canon-defining record, The Blue Notebooks, released in celebration of its 15th anniversary. Max is also in London to co-curate Sound and Visions, a marathon weekend event at the Barbican. Working with his longtime collaborator, artist Yulia Mahr, the pair have put together an ambitious programme that includes performances from Ambient producer Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith and American saxophonist Colin Stetson, alongside the first full-scale live performance in the UK of Max's 2010 album Infra. Today we're talking to Max about one of his favourite writers, the Japanese-born Haruki Murakami. I should start by saying I do feel a bit silly because I've had all these Murakami books in my house for so long. Because I have my flatmate Annette. She moved into a small flat ages ago before she moved into my flat, and she had all these boxes of things. And I said she could put them all in my storage cupboard, and then I had a bit of damp, internal damp, nothing to worry about. And some of her boxes got a little bit damp, so I took everything out of them, and there were just so many Murakami books. But there were also all the Harry Potter books.
All right, wow.
And I read all the Harry Potter books, but I'm still yet to read her Murakami.
Okay.
So this is going to give me like
give you a little start, yeah.
Yeah, because whenever we do these podcasts and it's on a book, I always end up buying said book or getting it out of the library, or I have like a reading pile still beside my bedside table. It just grows like every few weeks when we do something. Yeah, it's great.
Cool.
So yeah, I'm looking to you.
Okay.
You have to inspire me.
Okay.
So I guess the first question would be, how did you discover Murakami?
Right. Well, how did I discover Murakami? I'd sort of heard about this writer, Murakami, and I hadn't really ever connected to him. And this is probably going back 10 or 15 years, something like that. And his name was around, and people would say, oh yeah, that's an amazing book, or I've just read this one, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
And somehow I just never really sort of came across him. And then I was flying to Japan to play a gig, and I thought, here's my moment to, get a Murakami novel. And bizarrely, somebody in a band, this is going back a long time, this is like MySpace era.
Oh yeah.
Someone on my MySpace said, I love your music, you've got to read this Murakami. So I was like, okay, so I'm going to Japan, this guy's just written me this thing. So I'm going to get some Murakami and read it, while I'm in Japan.
Did you not worry about being like that tourist?
Well, I kind of like that. I like the sort of, it's almost like it sort of gives a sort of special effect, kind of glow to where you are, because you're sort of half in a sort of fictional world and half in the real world. So I bought his first novel, which is Norwegian Wood. Because I when I'm sort of getting into a new writer, I like to sort of kind of start at the beginning, because then you're sort of following their journey as well.
Was that his actual first novel?
Yeah, I think it was.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think he'd written some stories before, short
Right,
stories,
yeah.
which were published in Japan in various journals, but it was his first real publication. So I bought Norwegian Wood and read it, probably on the plane out there, I think. And I was sort of really, I mean, I wouldn't say, I wasn't like floored, but I was sort of enchanted, you know. And I think that's what he does. You know, he's, there were so many things in it that I liked and that I felt like I recognized, partly from other writers and partly from, I think, his worldview, which just kind of chimed with a lot of things I've been thinking about. Yeah, I was really convinced and persuaded, you know.
Yeah.
Because I think when you encounter a new writer, you're really sort of, it's almost like, I almost feel like I want to be sort of, it's not convinced about their sort of way of being, you know, because that's really what literature is, and I guess all creativity. It's about, you know, this is how I see it, this is my experience of being alive, this is, you know.
Yeah.
And then we share that experience in the creative work, and that's what's so exciting, you know, because then you get a window into another way of existing in the world, someone else's way of existing in the world. And I think that's what Murakami has very strongly. You know, he has a sort of he has a very particular viewpoint, which is sort of, there are lots of things about it which are really funny and very strange. And I was sort of really, really charmed by it. It's enchanting work because it has this sort of, you don't quite, well, you do know what's meant to be real and what's meant to be sort of imagined in the book, but he treats those two things as though they're the same.
Right.
You know, so he sort of flattens the space between like fact and fiction in a really nice way. And, you know, the book is about, I guess, a really formative time in everyone's life, which is a sort of this... Oh. Thank you for tea, magical tea. Thank you.
It's wonderful.
Thanks,
Thank you
Rebecca.
so much.
That's brilliant. So the book is about a really kind of formative and magical time for everyone, which is sort of, you know, leaving home, studying, being away for the first time, and the intensity of that experience, which is where you know, a lot of, you sort of try to figure out what kind of person you are and, you know, what your next steps are, and trying to construct meaning in the world and make sense of it, you know. So
making lots of mistakes.
Lots of mistakes and sort of some craziness and all of that. And, you know, that a lot of the book centers on that. And it has a kind of an autobiographical feel. I mean, it's all, you know, it's first person. It's very much, there's a lot of that sort of energy in it. Yeah,
I read it was a bit like a Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah.
Which is written intensely in the first person
Yeah.
with that, I can't remember what the character's called, but his kind of way of speaking is,
Yes.
It's very much part of
Yes,
the novel. Is it
it's-
written in that sort of...
It has, well, he's just talking about his experience. You know, the book opens with a kind of an older version of the central character flying into Hamburg on sort of business. It's very sort of, it's like it's just an ordinary day,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
20 years later sort of thing. And then he gets triggered back into this sort of memory state, and then he tells the novel.
Oh, cool.
It's very cool, you know,
Yeah,
and
it
I
is.
love that sense of like reality having trapdoors like that, you know, because, and again, that's a very Murakami thing. It's like there's a sort of equivalence in his world between the imaginary and the real, you know, that's really what he's all about. And yeah, I mean, it's a love story. It's a story of somebody discovering themselves. And it's also political, you know, it's the backdrop to it is the kind of student unrests and stuff in Tokyo at that time. And I think it sort of feeds into the kind of mythological aspect of Murakami. You know, I mean, he's a kind of... I always feel with him that he's got a sort of the quality of a conjurer, you know.
Mm.
There's a lot of sort of misdirection in his work, because he's very, very skilled at sort of manipulating your consciousness into particular states. You know, and he does that in a very, very clever and subtle way. And, you know, I think there's a sort of playfulness in it. And I guess it even connects into, you know, things like his origin story of how he even became a writer.
Yeah.
You know, which is the most brilliant, brilliant origin story. If, you know, this guy hitting a home run, and as the baseball flies through the air, Murakami's in the stands watching his favourite team, you know, and as the baseball flies through the air, at a certain point he decides he's going to become a novelist before it lands. Right, and it's just like he has this sort of epiphany, and he's kind of all about that, you know, that sort of magical, transforming moments.
So he was literally at a ball game, and the guy it says he hit a double. I don't know baseball.
I don't know baseball is either. It's a home run, right?
Must be something like
something
2
spectacular.
home runs or something. I don't know. Yeah, and he literally just...
And he decided before the ball lands that, you know, that's it, he's going to be a writer.
Then just goes home and writes a novel in 10 months.
Sort of, yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah. And at that time, I think he was running a jazz bar. You know, he had that.
Yeah.
That's what he was doing. That was his sort
he
of
and
day
his
job.
wife owned a jazz called Peter Cat.
Yes.
Which is
it's very good, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's a kind of anime name, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's got a sort of Studio Ghibli sort of...
Apparently he doesn't like manga, though. This is something else that I read.
That's interesting.
Because it does seem like he sort of shirks Japanese culture a little bit from what I've read. All his inspirations and the literature that he grew up on was quite sort of Anglo-American.
Well, I mean, if you think about I always think like the precursor writers for Murakami are American writers, really.
Apparently it's because his dad taught Japanese literature.
Oh, so he's got sort of a father issues.
And he was just like, he just didn't want to talk to his dad
get away
about
from it.
Yeah,
Right,
if he started reading the Japanese books, his dad
Right.
would tell him this is the way it should be, and I don't think he wanted to be told.
Well, that's a classic sort of father story, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, he actually translated Scott Fitzgerald, which I think is quite interesting about him, because I mean, Scott Fitzgerald is beautifully made writing, isn't it, and very emotional. I think another writer that I sort of feel like sort of hovers behind Murakami a lot is Raymond Carver.
Yeah.
And in fact, he does paraphrase a Raymond Carver title later on in what we talk about when we talk about running. You know, is a paraphrase of a Raymond Carver.
That was one of the first times that I heard of Murakami. I had a friend who was very into running.
Yeah.
And I really like to run as well, and he told me that I should read it. Is it sort of a long essay?
It's a long essay on why he runs and what it's like.
Because he's done an ultra marathon, which is crazy.
Yeah, he's a serious runner.
Yeah.
He's kind of a serious everything. Do you know what I mean? He's he's got a massive record collection. He's a writing machine. It seems like whatever he does, he does it to sort of the maximum.
Yeah, he seems very, very focused.
Yeah.
Yeah. But he didn't start writing, I think, until 29.
Yeah.
And didn't start running until he was 33, which also kind of gives me this weird hope inside.
Yeah, it's all still there.
Yeah.
It's all still out there.
Like maybe if I could focus like Murakami.
Yeah. Focus
then
like
what
Murakami.
could I potentially achieve?
that sounds like a...
They're playing
like
the
rap
Barfly tonight.
That's right, yeah, exactly, yeah. That's brilliant.
But yeah, I mean, have you read his running essay?
Yeah.
What does he... I mean, what does it detail? Does it detail his sort of stretching regimen?
Yeah, well, he talks a lot about preparation, and, you know, he sort of does analyses of various runs he's done, and like running experiences, you know, why he goes out, where he goes in the mornings. He's running on, you know, Hawaii or wherever he is. He gets a residency at some university, I think, and his experience of running there. And he basically uses it to kind of riff on all sorts of other things. You know, so running as a metaphor for, you know, whatever, you know, all sorts of stuff. And It's a nice book, actually. I mean, I'm not a runner, and I've sort of never understood running.
Yeah.
You know, because like for me, running is like strictly functional. You know, it's for a bus, or you know, or you know, that's running.
Yeah.
But I know that, you know, people do. It's like a religion for some people, right?
Yeah.
And he is. Yeah, he's very serious about it and quite ambitious. You know.
Well, I mean, to do an ultramarathon, you have to be very ambitious. Yeah.
You know, so I guess that's, it's a big part of his life. I have a sense that, you know, in all his writing, there is like a typical Murakami character.
Okay.
Who's this kind of, you know, educated, rather sort of inward, sort of neat and tidy, thoughtful, slightly depressed person who's very imaginary. Very imaginative, and you think, well, he's probably talking about himself there.
Yeah.
You know, given what we know of his, you know, his various obsessions. So it is tempting to kind of, you know, read that, you know, sort of map him onto those characters.
Is it ever tempting to map yourself onto those characters?
Well, I think, you know, the thing about Murakami's writing is that the characters do live in this world which is sort of half imaginary, half real, and it's a sort of very fertile, sort of dream-infused kind of a universe where, you know, counterintuitive things happen. You know, you get, you know, talking cats, buildings appearing, disappearing, giant worms, and it's all, you know, and it's all sort of very treated very matter-of-factly.
Yeah.
And so it gives this sort of weird sense of like altered states. You know, the sort of mundane world, the normal world has got this kind of magical sort of shadow side sort of hovering inside it. And you never quite know, you know, where the sort of boundaries between those things are. And I think that's something very similar to, you know, the way a lot of creative people view the world. You know, it is this sort of place of sort of potential, and I mean, for me that really chimes. It's not that I think that there is a, you know, kind of superworm sort of holding the city of London together, or
I suppose that's what I meant when I said about mapping yourself onto that sort of character, because all the people that I've ever, you know, heard talk about Murakami or seen reading it are kind of friends who are in that like well-educated, creative, sort of sometimes perhaps more prone to a little bit of a depressive trough. That does seem to ring true with a lot of the people that I've spoken to about Murakami in the past.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there is a again, sort of going back to this sort of typical Murakami character, you know, very often these people are sort of at a bit of either a crossroads or a dead end, you know. They're just sort of treading water in their lives. You know, the number of descriptions in Murakami of, you know, someone going out, you know, shopping for lunch, going home and like, you know, making a bowl of pasta, sitting down, doing the washing up, eating the, you know, and that, I mean, that's what happens. And it's all quite sort of, you know, nothing to see here, you know, there's nothing happening, right? And yet you sort of feel like kind of everything is happening as well. But it's really interesting. So there are these guys who are just, these people who are just sort of, they're like a little bit like the sort of lost sock in the washing machine. You know, there's that sort of sense of them being a little disconnected, a little bit other in some way. And
what is it about that kind of mundanity that he can create such beauty and such imagination around? What is it, his turn of phrase, or is it the way that he parallels these sort of mundane everyday things next to these fantastical but also quite matter-of-fact creations? Yes,
I think there are a lot of different things going on to sort of cause these amazing effects in the books. I mean, I think the first thing is that he is very aware of the sort of beauty of small things, which is something I think which is really often overlooked, you know, especially with, you know, in creative work, there is a kind of, there's like a sort of arms race almost going on a lot of the time, you know. musically, you know, the sort of, you know, the biggest, most dramatic emotional effects, or, you know, the biggest beats or something, or you know, some, you know, enormous sort of story arcs with sort of huge events in them. In cinema, of course, we've got that whole sort of, you know, very inflated sort of blockbuster you know, CGI sort of world, you know, which is all about effects, you know, sort of sound and fury, you know, right? So it's all about, everything is like bigger, louder, more. Yeah. And I think he is, you know, he's quite suspicious of that, I think. He's not really very interested in it. He's more interested in the tiny stuff, you know, and the way that, you know, a life can be made up of a lot of small things. And there is that sort of, you know, that probably has something, to some extent it's in Japanese culture, I think. You know, if we think about, you know, sort of Shinto and Zen and those sorts of ideas about concentrating on, you know, the essentials, the small things. Not that I don't think Murakami is remotely interested in those things from a spiritual side. Yeah. And the fact that he sort of pretty much disavowed that, I think. But I think it's cultural, you know, this idea of, like, valuing small things. Yeah. I think there's something very beautiful about that, actually.
Yeah, there kind of is. Yeah. Now that, but once someone explains something in that sort of sense, or puts that amount of effort into demonstrating it, suddenly it just feels poetic.
Yeah, I mean, there is a poetry in that, though, isn't there? I mean, you know, it's about a kind of quality of attention, and I think that's a very writerly thing, you know, really giving attention to stuff. And he certainly does that. You know, he describes these, you know, really quite ordinary activities very beautifully, and with the sort of a tenderness, actually, for just simple actions.
I did notice when I was researching for this podcast that I didn't... Normally when you have an article about a writer, they kind of tend to reference the genre. So it would be like Stephen King, horror writer, or, oh God, who am I thinking of? Patricia someone, who's that crime writer.
Highsmith, yeah. Yeah.
But I couldn't see any genres.
Yeah, well, there kind of isn't a genre. Yeah. I mean, he writes really broadly. I mean, you know, like a piece like Norwegian Wood is sort of very romantic, sort of Bildungsroman, we say in German. You know, it's this sort of idea of like a novel of the journey into life, you know, into adulthood. Or, you know, there are bits of Murakami which are really sci-fi, you know, and there are things which feel like sort of magic. I guess it connects a bit to sort of magic realism in a way. You know, there's all kinds of fantastical elements. But you don't really feel like he's like sort of not like anyone else, really, in that he's just sort of he's sort of pursuing his it's like he's following the material, you know. And you sometimes feel like the oddest things happen, like very sort of like there's this I'm trying to remember what it's called. There's a character who's a sort of sheep. He's like this hybrid sheep person in, is it Hard-Boiled Wonderland, I think? I can't remember. And you just sort of, he's never really explained why he's like that. And sort of nothing happens. And yet it's like, there's something very affecting. This, Max. There's something very affecting about it, you know. I mean, I mean, he's very interesting in that way. Okay. You know? It's the sort of irrationality. I think Kafka is also there, actually, as a sort of, you know, he hovers behind it.
I mean, it took me about a year and a half just to read Crime and Punishment.
No, Crime and Punishment, not Kafka. That's
no, that was Dostoevsky, wasn't it? No, yeah. The Trial. That's
the Trial, yes.
Of. Yeah, that one only took me about a year.
That is a heavy read, but it's like deliberately heavy, right? It's unreadable because it's just nothing happens over and over again. It's just sort of, it wears you down, right? The book has the effect on you.
Oh God, I just found it so frustrating.
The character is going through. Yeah. Right? Your whole life has just been used up trying to read this book.
I think I actually had two different copies. I think I had to either give back or I lost the first one.
Yeah, that was like a Freudian slip. You just like threw it away. Oh, I've lost it. I've lost The Trial by Kafka. I just don't know where it is.
Oh gosh. Yeah. Okay. But then, I feel like people don't talk about him with such a heavy heart that we might reserve for the more kind of like intense Russian literature writers.
I think that's true. I mean, he, of course, is like Kafka on the Shore is a late one as well. So, I mean, he's obviously there somewhere, but it's this sort of use of things which are really absurd to kind of either contextualize or kind of spark new story directions.
So how much of his works have you read? Is it kind of addictive? Do you read one and then crave for that sort of style of writing? And
well, I think you want to. I think it really depends on your sort of what kind of person you are. I mean, for me, they feel incredibly comfortable as a sort of a place to be, because it's this world which is got a kind of a thoughtfulness. It has got a kind of, I think it is kind of warm-hearted, but it's sort of 51% warm-hearted, which is like, it's just that. It's very nuanced, his writing.
Yeah.
A friend of mine said it in a good way. She said, Murakami's work is like lukewarm water. So it's like, and she meant that as a compliment, so it's got this kind of very soft, gentle, beguiling quality. But it doesn't sort of come at you. And it's not sort of, look at my writing. It isn't really like that. And I really enjoy that about it.
Do you think that's another thing that kind of comes from having that Japanese culture? Because they're quite a modest people.
It's a sort of restraint, I guess. Yeah, there's a kind of, it's very elegant writing, but it's not flashy writing. I mean, I'm saying this. I haven't read him in Japanese, of course, but these are the.
I saw he puts a lot of care into the English translation.
He does. One of his translators, Jay Rubin, they kind of work together on it quite a bit.
Yeah, and then he allows that to be translated into other languages, but then people have gone back since and done translations into French and German from his original.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever read any in German?
No.
Just in English?
No, I've read them in English.
Right, yeah. So you decided to use some of his, I was going to say lyrics then, but that's not right, is it? Quotes from his books?
Yeah, I used some fragments in Songs from Before.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love, in the records I love to use more than just like musical sounds instrument. I use electronic music, found sounds, the studio, text, voices. And I wanted to make a record which had a kind of sort of interior, personal kind of a world. The Blue Notebooks, which was the record before the Murakami record, that had Kafka on it and Czeslaw Milosz, but that was a political record. In a way, it's sort of outward-facing record. So the Songs from Before was a kind of, it's like an interior sort of record. And Murakami, there's a sort of magical, sort of a private space he sets up in the books. And I wanted to try and sort of explore that with this record. So I just chose a few little fragments from 2 or 3 different books. And just kind of, and just kind of positioned those as kind of cues, really, to the way the music kind of sets off.
Were they quotes that you already loved, or did you get to reread with a different kind of mindset?
Yeah, you do, because when you're reading, you think, oh, that's great, and sort of scribble on it, but then, I had this sort of, when I first got into Murakami, I read the first one, and then I was like, wow, this is great. So then I sort of binged about sort of 4 or 5.
Okay, so you did do a binge.
Yeah,
you did.
So in my mind, they're all a bit jumbled up, to be honest. I just sort of blasted through them. Like a junkie, and, more Murakami. And
I mean, if you're going to be addicted to anything.
yeah, okay, exactly, harmless, kind of. So then I started thinking, which bits I would try to sort of use in the record, and actually when you're thinking about text from that standpoint, it's it takes on a different dimension, because obviously you can only use a little bit. So in a way, each individual little fragment becomes kind of bigger. So I set off I got asked Robert Wyatt to record these for me, and which is brilliant. I mean, he's wonderful. He's absolutely wonderful.
He's got a wonderful voice.
He's got a wonderful voice, and I mean, he's an amazing musician, an amazing sort of songwriter. Was an incredible drummer before his accident, and I just think that was a nice sort of collision, really. I first became aware of Robert's work in this, as a drummer in a Soft Machine. An amazing band, really, and very creative, and sort of, I almost felt like, I mean, they were sort of, I guess, parallel to the kind of early Pink Floyd, sort of very psychedelic English thing, and that kind of dream space that they inhabited has a sort of Murakami-ish echo, that sort of anything's possible kind of, you don't quite know what's happening, sort of magical space. So it was great to have him involved,
Have you ever had any personal connection with Murakami? Has he ever commented on it, or
no?
I can't imagine he'd be the kind of guy that would be tweeting about it.
I don't think I think he's very private. He's just a very private guy, and I don't think I think he regards his business as that of writing, not anything associated with being a public figure.
Yeah.
I mean, when Norwegian Wood was published at the beginning, he basically became sort of housebound, because it was such a massive hit in Japan. He sort of couldn't go out.
Wow.
And I think
Harry
that's
Styles of Japan.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what prompted because they lived in Hawaii for a while.
Right.
I think that was sort of what prompted that. He kind of fled.
God, and his routine is insane.
Yeah.
Like, he seems so regimented. When he's writing, he gets up every morning at, I think, 4 a.m.
Yeah.
or something like that, and writes for a set number of hours.
Yeah.
And then goes for a long run, and then a little bit of leisure in the evening, and then to bed by 9.
Yeah.
I mean, I could definitely get on board with the bed by 9 bit.
Yeah. Well, I think, in a way, creative work, that is great for getting stuff done. It's amazing.
Kind of do something similar when you're working on a project?
I do sometimes, yes. If I have a lot to do and it's intense, then I will go into a kind of a sort of monastic mode.
It's important to make yourself stop as well, though.
Yeah, it is. I mean, in a way, it reminds me a little bit of Philip Glass talking about, when he was starting to be a composer. He basically just said, right, I'm going to be sitting at the piano with a pencil in my hand, every day at 11 in the morning or something. I'm going to sit there for 2 hours no matter what happens. And he did. That's what he did. And after a while, something did start happening. Yeah. Because you have to sort of train your mind, right?
Yeah, of course.
You go to the mind gym.
I mean, it's just like, it's so hard to focus in this day and age, because you'll sit down at your computer to do something, and then someone will have sent you an email, and then it'll make you think of that novelist's name that you've forgotten, so you'll type that into a search engine, and then you read their Wikipedia page, and then you'll think, oh, I wonder if any of my friends like that on Facebook, and then you just end up in this spiral of information, and it's all completely unnecessary.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, I think that's one of the really big challenges of our lives today. At least, psychological challenges in the, sort of developed, affluent world where we can have these problems, you know what I mean?
Of course, yeah.
But,
life is so difficult with
it's
my
a
MacBook.
nightmare, isn't it? Yeah.
All the information at my fingertips and all the cat gifs.
Yeah, but I mean, it is a big challenge. It's a big challenge, and I think it's so easy to get kind of, consumed by all of that sort of flickering screen sort of brain,
In that sense, Murakami's works do sound like they could be quite a nice escape.
They are, yeah. I mean, I think so. It is, in a way, it's a kind of low information universe, you know. A few things happen and they all have a kind of magical significance because of that. Yeah.
I feel like I want to buy some of his novels from a second-hand bookshop. Because you know when you buy second-hand books sometimes and you're reading through them and the person who's owned them before will have underlined a certain passage. Yes. And sometimes you're like, oh, actually, like that is a really beautiful turn of phrase that I wouldn't have given as much attention to. But sometimes they're just absolutely baffling. You're like, why have you underlined that? That makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, you see, that would be a very Murakami thing to do, actually. Go to a second-hand bookshop, buy a book, find somebody who'd underlined something really like, why did anyone underline that? It's a very Murakami event.
Oh, okay. So what's my starting point as a complete novice? Do you think Norwegian Wood's the good place to start?
Norwegian Wood is where he started. So, in a way, and I don't mean this in a bad way, I mean this in a good way, he's got a world which he sort of keeps writing through. So in a way, he's sort of always writing the same novel, but from like different and I mean that as a compliment. I really do. You know, Norwegian Wood is the beginning of something, and there really is. It's almost like walking around a sculpture. You know, you can look at it from one side, and then you walk a little bit and you see something else, but it's the same sculpture, and you really have that sense with Murakami. That's one world which he's sort of shining a light through it at different angles all the time.
Are there more recurring characters than just the sort of version of himself? I mean, you say about the sheep man. Does he come up with?
I don't know. I can't. There's also. I mean, the thing is, I guess there are characters, but they're more to do with like character types. There's all these kind of lost people. They're not necessarily particularly down about it, but they just kind of a bit disconnected. Okay. You know, and so. Yeah, I mean, that's his universe, you know.
If you started out reading Norwegian Wood in Japan, did that not kind of, having that world around you, which you said brought so much as the text, was it not like a little bit disappointing when you had to come back and read the others?
Well,
in our English culture.
Well, yeah, but a novel is something that transports you. So when you're there, you know, you're reading that book, you're there. And I think for me, reading Norwegian Wood in Japan was, I mean, Japan is like a total immersion experience because it is so intense. But as somebody who doesn't speak or read Japanese, it's very, it's overwhelming actually.
Yeah.
Because there are no signs in English anywhere.
Wow.
You know, so you really just sort of, and you'd think, oh, well, they all speak English, but they don't.
No.
They really don't.
Oh my God, of course we'd think
so,
that.
You know, it's just like, yeah, but you think of them, you know, Japan as being like really forward, you know, it's for technology, the future, all of that. Yeah. So you just think, oh, well, they probably all speak English, we'll be fine. They don't. So you can't read anything and you can't talk to anyone. And you're in this place, which is just really different.
How do tourists get by? I've never been myself. I've kind of always wanted to wait till I had a reason to go. Yeah. You know, because otherwise I feel like I would be even more lost.
Yeah, well, you're lost.
Yeah.
But in a really good way, you know, you're like lost in like this creative way.
It's
good. It's good.
Okay, so Norwegian Wood, do you have a personal favourite?
I don't know. Yeah, that's difficult. I mean, they're all good, really, to be honest. I mean, Norwegian Wood, obviously, is the first one, so, you know, that made a big impression. The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle is amazing. You know, it's huge and complex, and it's sort of political as well, and it does history and all kinds of stuff in there. Kafka on the Shore is beautiful. It's kind of autumnal. Again, it's a sort of a love story. Really good. IQ 84, which is the most recent big one, is really interesting because it's sort of got a couple of new things in it. Like, it's his world, but he's sort of growing out from it, and it's got one or two really incredible moments, which just sort of, which, I mean, he's just very, very good, basically. Like there's a kind of a subsidiary character, a secondary character in IQ 84. He's this hitman, right? We don't really know anything about this hitman. He's just this little guy, you know, he just walks on, basically. He's around. In the novel, he serves a function, you know, so. And at a certain point, this hitman is murdered. And he describes the way this guy is murdered. And then in that sort of tiny last bit of this guy's life, you learn something completely different about him. You learn, basically, so as he's dying, he remembers a completely different life, which you were not aware of, because he's portrayed as this gangster, sort of guy. And then as he's dying, he remembers this little house with his 2 kids and the dog playing on the lawn. And it's just so beautiful. And you just think that there's a sort of whole humanity behind this character. And it's just breathtaking, you know.
I'm really sorry. I know what you're describing does sound incredibly deep and probably very moving when you're reading the novel.
It is absolutely.
All
it floors
I'm thinking about is Austin Powers when they kill the henchman.
Okay, right. That was different. Also different. But I mean, it's an amazing, you know, it's just like he is a sort of a conjurer in that way, you know.
Have any of his novels been made into movies?
Yes, there is one, well, there are 2 now, actually. Norwegian Wood was made by a fantastic Vietnamese filmmaker called Tran Anh Hung, who made a beautiful film called The Scent of Green Papaya quite a long time ago. It's a lovely film. I actually haven't seen the Norwegian Wood, but I mean, he's a really good filmmaker.
That's cool.
And then there was a film made of one of his short stories, which got a beautiful Sakamoto score, actually, Richter Sakamoto score. Cool. Which is a really, really nice piece of filmmaking. Yeah.
Is there anything that I've missed? Are there any kind of entry points or little bits about his life that you personally find fascinating and think that we should share with people listening?
Other stuff. I guess, I mean, one of the things he's into is he's really into music.
Yeah.
He's massive on jazz, and he's very interested in classical music.
Right, okay.
And he has done this book with, which is a book of conversations with conductor Sergio Tsawa, where they just talk about music, basically, and sort of, you know, Schubert and Beethoven and things.
The whole book?
Yeah, it's just them chatting.
He's done another book, another kind of compilation book as well, I was reading.
Oh, yeah? Probably.
Which features lots of stories from other people, but I can't remember for the life of me.
Oh yeah, he did some translations, yeah. It's a Ray Carver story and a couple of other things.
Yeah, and they're all under one theme. I'm not sure what it was, though.
Yeah, but that music book is quite fun.
That's nice.
Yeah.
Do you need to already have quite a base level knowledge of, say, classical or jazz?
It's mostly about classical music.
Okay.
It's about, you know, so, you know, if you're into classical music, it's kind of fun. Yeah.
So he has like, wow, how many records was it? Like
thousands and thousands.
No, that's 60,000?
Could be.
60,000 seems more likely. 600,000 seems far too many records.
Could be. I mean, yeah, people collect records, right?
Yeah. But it seems kind of incredible that he had I'm assuming it was successful jazz cafe at the age of like 29 with his wife. And then embarked on this completely different career.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's clearly he's a very talented guy, you know, but also very incredibly focused.
Yeah.
You know?
I need some of that focus.
I remember, I don't know if you've seen that film Jiro Dreams of Sushi. Have you seen it? It's a brilliant movie. It's about this guy who runs a sushi restaurant in a Tokyo subway station. Very ordinary looking place, you know, it's like a kind of bar stroke restaurant, but it's kind of the best sushi restaurant in Japan. And people go there from travel from around the world to go there to have this sushi. And it's run by this guy Jiro, who's old, and he's got 2 sons. And you know, the sons are like both working for him, you know, but they're like, they don't have the seriousness that he has, right? And there's a brilliant thing in where Jiro's being interviewed by the director, David Gelb, who actually made Chef's Table. I don't know if you've ever seen that yet. So, So he interviews him and he says, what do you think about, your sons, carrying on the business and how's that all going to work and stuff? And he says, well, all my son has to do, and he means this in a good way, He says, all my son has to do is get out of bed in the morning and do the same thing, exactly the same thing, every day for the rest of his life, and he'll be just fine. And there's something so Japanese about that, and you could sort of see Murakami getting out of bed at 4 a.m, and it's that is focus, right?
Yeah.
So,
and that's tougher than it sounds.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. A big thanks to Max and also to Rebecca for the cups of tea. Other literary podcasts are available at talktheline.blog, including Ben from Blindavon on German literature, Eva Hendricks from Charlie Bliss on comic books, and Emily from the Staves on adult fantasy fiction, including Philip Pullman. Next week, I'm talking to Turv Stryker on personality types. You've been listening to Talk the Line. I'm Jen Long. This is a podcast from The Line of Best Fit, the UK's premier website for new music discovery. It was produced by Paul Bridgewater, who is looking to expand his podcast network, so hit them up if you have got an idea. Original music is by Seams. Please subscribe to this podcast if you're a fan. Follow us on social media for podcast-related updates. And if you really like it, you could be an angel and leave us a nice review.